We are going to go into the Q&A. So let me get the first question, and I believe this one's for Thomas.
Are we looking for variety names and numbers, or are we using hard red winter, or we use primarily hard red winter wheat grown in the High Plains region around where the mill is. We use a little bit of hard spring wheat in the strong red flour, but most of our flours now are entirely hard red winter, which gives the dough better extensibility than you'd get with spring. So you can get a little more volume, and it's a little more tender crumb when the bread's done. And you get a much better shred, and so the ginge on your baguettes can really be open, especially if you're using just what we call our AP flour, which is a little higher in protein than a lot of APs. For all purpose, it's 11.4, 11.5.
Oh wow, yeah.
That's all from winter wheat. So we have bakers that are making biscuits that will use that flour because it's such a soft crumb, but we also have bakers making baguettes and long fermented San Francisco style sourdoughs.
Interesting.
And it works well on all of those applications. And primarily because of the fermentation. I mean, fermentation is such an important part of making good bread. And one thing that Dr. Lynn said early on, the things to look for in your bulk fermentation was dough maturity. And I think, I don't know in the larger, baking industry, but certainly among artisan bakers, it's something that is still not understood enough. And what Dr. Lynn also said about the touching a mature dough, it's a little bit of heaven on earth. Once you know what it is, you feel it.
It is.
And I think that the other phrase from Mark was my sophisticated sensory analyzers. And that's what our hands become. And they will tell you more than any instrument can tell you once you train them for 50 years.
Yes.
Right.
But I think dough maturity from fermentation, it just improves your bread in so many ways. Like ciabatta, people often will say, my ciabatta dough is sticking to everything because you didn't let it ripen in the bulk fermentation.
Yes.
A friend and I who were baking, both of us using Heartland flour in different bakeries, making ciabatta, we got into kind of a hydration war. We got up to we started at 81,
I've
82.
seen 90, 92,
we got up to 91% using,
Nice.
And at that point, the flour from Heartland was at 11%, 11 to 11.2, so it was lower protein. But we got 91% ciabatta that you could handle well. I mean, and you can imagine how open the crumb was in that and how crisp.
Well, yes, and it's not just a matter of how much protein or the protein quantity. It's got a lot to do with the protein quality. So, you can have I remember many years ago, just the milling, the type of wheat and the characteristics of the milling process in Canada are somewhat different than many of the mills in the United States. And we were owned and operated by I'll just say a large milling company at the time, right? And they couldn't understand why we were selling our 14% high ash wheat flour at a premium. And they wanted us to discount it because they could not get a 14, and this was like a 65 ash, 14% protein they couldn't produce that in their mills with the wheat that they had, right? I mean, they couldn't, it had no baking quality. Whereas in Canada, that's what is used primarily in rye bread production. Rather than adding gluten, they add these high ash flours because they're kind of grayish in color, and with the rye, it doesn't matter, right? And so if you try to do a ciabatta with that type of flour, it doesn't work. Because it's a different quality of protein. Whereas if you have something like a good quality 10 to 11.5% protein, you get much better results, right? Because the quality of the protein is there, the better extensibility and things.
Talking about ash, let's get to this question.
And anywhere from 44 to 180, depending on what you're making. 180 is whole wheat, and like an Italian type 00 is 44 to 48. French type 50 on their system is 50. It's more like a 55 because they test dry, we test it. With moisture.
Am I correct to say that artisan breads are a little more forgiving on the ash values?
Well, it's not that it's more forgiving, it's just a very broad term. Like if I'm making a baguette and I want to make a classic French baguette, I'm going to want an ash, in the 0.5 range. But if I'm making, a pain de campagne, I'm going to want an ash, type 80 or higher. So 80, 90, even the 120 bolted turkey flour, you can make a really beautiful pain de campagne with.
Yeah.
So it really depends what you're making. To make a baguette, I don't think, that you want to be like a classic baguette. You don't really want ash above 55, at the very most 60.
Yes, for what people understand today as being a baguette, yes. Yeah,
but
absolutely.
you can make good breads of both Italian, French, and German style with ashes, anywhere from a white flour to a whole grain flour. And I think Mark did some really interesting stuff of combining flours and even self-sifting some of the coarsest bran off of the whole wheat, which is, and you can, in a smaller operation, you can do all these things.
Yes, yeah.
If you've got a large production facility, a lot of bakers now are putting, smaller bakers and some medium size are putting in their own mills, which is common in Germany, but it's pretty rare here, but it's a real movement. And then you can kind of create your own flour, have a bolter set up with a mill, and you can create a flour very much like a French type 80 or type 90 flour.
So this segues into the next question.
I think
you want.
It's the same question again.
Yeah.
Right, but you see, not every bakery has the ability to get one kind of flour for baguette, one kind of flour for,
well, I mean, so you're going to
Vienna
use
loaves, or what is a good flour for all, that you could use.
You need decent protein, like above 11, and you don't want it too high because you lose your extensibility, because that's usually coming from spring wheat. And I think you want your ash to be in this 0.55 to 0.6 range.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
And
like
then,
60 or below.
And you can always, if you want a darker crumb and more grainy flavor, you can combine your primary white flour, unbleached flour, with whole wheat, with a bolted turkey, with light rye, with whole rye. And then that's but if you are doing that, then your basic unbleached flour, that's the base for everything you make, has to be a good quality and has to be consistent, and has to have a good balance of elasticity and extensibility. Because you don't want it too extensible or it's just going to go flat, even with long
Okay.
fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So let's go on to the next question.
We are certified by a third-party certifying agency, like everybody has to be, USDA standards. And we've been organics. We were the first certified organic mill in the US way back in the 1980s.
Wow.
Which is, with a
Wow, that's
mill
cool.
started by a group of farmers who knew they had a really good product and they were just hauling it to the local elevator. Then we need to get our flour milled from our wheat into the hands of bakers directly, rather than having it just go into the the mainstream railroad cart and get milled into whatever.
This is a common question a lot of people have in terms of when they grow a bakery is how do I work with my yeast? And I don't know if Joanna can do this. Joanna, can you copy the URL for the yeast spec page? And if you have any questions on trying to convert from dry yeast to cream yeast or compressed yeast to cream yeast, go to this particular page on yeast spec, and it tells you the total solids of these particular products and how you can convert based on the total solids. Okay, so that's a very common question that people usually ask, but I want to make sure that all of you out there know that this page supports that answer.
Yeah, I would say the main thing that you see is in the end product is the flavor. That is one of the main things. In processing, you'll see usually a little bit more extensibility with the poolish, right? Just in terms of the whole enzyme activity and stuff. So it has more give, which is for rolling out a baguette that you want to make into that long stick, that the poolish is helpful that way. With a biga, it's often used for things like ciabatta, where there's very gentle shaping, very little shaping, or even things like panettone and stuff where you're incorporating a lot of fruit and things like that. So you don't have to worry about a lot of stretching and things like that. And so you want a little bit more elasticity, I guess is the word I'm looking for in that sense. So in processing, I would say poolish is more extensible, less elastic, and the biga is a little more elastic. In the flavors, the poolish has a little bit slight sour note to it, a little bit more, and the biga tends to have more of a fermented note to it, less of the lactic acid note.
So here's a question for both of you. Which do you prefer?
For me, it's depending on the product I'm making. I like using poolish for a lot of different things, but when I'm doing high hydration, I like the biga. I just find that it gives me more strength.
Yeah,
How about you?
I would agree with that. I mean, I also think the practicality in a bakery of mixing a biga in a mixer, and it's not as messy. I mean, we often do the same thing. I mean, baguettes traditionally are poolish, and primarily because of that extra extensibility. So you can really, especially working like by hand on a bench, but also in a French baguette molder. I mean, they work a lot better if they're relaxed, and you'll get that with the poolish. And this reminds me of like one of my good baking teachers, Dr. high learner at Baldwin Hill Bakery, said, that we made nothing but naturally leavened bread, no commercial yeast. But he was saying, like, the quality of your starter is going to determine the quality of your bread.
Yeah.
And if you have a stiff starter, your bread is going to be, and whether it's a yeast starter or a biga, or whether it's a stiff levain sourdough, your bread is going to have more elasticity and strength and hold its shape better. You use a liquid, and either sourdough or a poolish, it'll be more relaxed. And some people think that you need that poolish to get a real open crumb in a loaf of bread, but I find that's more determined on mature dough and how you handle it, because
Good point.
just keep those gases in it.
Every bakery has a lot of space. Come on, what are you talking about? What's the best bulk fermentation you guys can recommend?
I think, well, I mean, I think in terms of pre-ferment, I think what Thomas touched on is a big part of where things go is the biga. You don't see that many places doing poolish anymore, unless it was something, like an artisan bakery that is set up for the space, like one of the ones we visited in Portland recently. The other thing that I used to see a lot too is, especially like in donut bakeries and stuff, because yeast-raised donuts, there's also a lot of flavor there too, but is what the French call pâte fermentée, which is basically leftover yeast-raised dough from the day before's production. So that you're always having like something like a 10 to 15% addition of pre-fermented dough from the day before, so that can just be retarded in bins or whatever. So something that is easy to keep in a bin, or if you have multiple mixing bowls, that you can swap bowls out in the process, so that you have either only an overnight, like a 10 to 12 hour biga, or and commercial bakeries, they use sponge and dough primarily, because that's only a 4-hour sponge.
Okay.
And they just use big troughs for that.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Do we have time for one more quick question? Let's do this.
It does. Of course, flours take longer to absorb water. They take longer to develop the gluten. So they certainly affect bread making.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to, the finer you have it, is going to be more damaged starch, so that's going to affect also the dough development, the texture of the dough and everything. So it's going to have more surface area to hydrate. The other thing is that you're, looking at it from a commercial aspect, is that you're not going to get a miller to necessarily want to make it finer than they have to, because that costs a lot of energy, time, and money. So it's consistency is the most important thing. In terms of the reference to cakes, I would say that in a non-organic, I'm not familiar with all of the setups in Heartland, but in some of the commercial flour mills, is that cake flour is produced as a rebolt of pastry flour. So it's basically, part of it is taken off, if you will. It's like the higher protein pastry flour from the soft wheat, and then it is remilled and chlorinated to denature the protein for cake production. While the particle size is slightly finer, that's the nature of the grain itself, and not so much in wanting to make it finer. And so, like, you know, the trick in the kitchen I always show cooks is that if you can't tell which is all-purpose and which is pastry, just take a handful and squeeze it together and open your hand. And if it's pastry flour, it's all going to be lumped together because it's a finer particle size. Whereas all-purpose and bread flour will not hold together and not lump as easily because it is just slightly coarser. Not that you could see it or feel it with your fingers, but because of the hardness of the material of the grain, it is only makes sense to mill it to a certain point, which is now I forgot what the typical microns is, but Lynn and I had that conversation the other day.
I learned something new today. What you could do to your pastry flour to determine whether it's bread or pastry flour. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah. I mean, I think with Thomas, all I would have to do is show up 2 handfuls, and he'd look at the color and know which. Yeah,
you'll be like, I know which one it is.
But yeah, I mean, you know, in a kitchen when sometimes in a kitchen when things are you know, heated, right? Things are going very quickly. And how do you check quickly? Did somebody get the lids mixed up or not? And for me, it's been in teaching in a community college, the students get the lids mixed up all the time, right? And sometimes
they do in bakeries too.
Yeah. Sometimes I think they're doing it just to play tricks on each other, right? But and so I would always double check. I would just take a handful, squeeze it, and then I make sure I know I got pastry flour when I want it, right?
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Mark, for joining me today and answering all these interesting questions about artisan bread production. This recording is going to be available next week on the Academy. So if you think someone should be listening to this, or if you want to download the PDF, go onto the Academy today. You're going to get 1 token for that. Okay. And the person that gets the most token at the end of the month gets to talk to Mark or I. We're going to offer a consulting for you guys. Okay. All right. Thank you all for joining us today.
Great.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Take care. See you.